Hello viewers, welcome
Hi.
to another episode of the Hipstorians. Derek, do you know where we are?
I could have a wild guess, Neil.
Let's
Fairness,
turn
but let's have a
around
look.
and have a look.
Through the magic door.
Boom! Check it out.
Wellington Monument, Phoenix Park, Dublin, largest enclosed park in Europe, might I add.
Yes.
So, Wellington Monument, what are we doing here?
What are we doing here? Okay, Derek, we each have our own, we've a grand interest in history. I think viewers picked it up by now, but each of us has our own particular loves or specialty and just battlefields. In your case that we spoke about recent episode was Verdun in France.
Yeah.
That epic encounter between the French and German armies in the First World War. For me, for some reason, it's Waterloo.
It is. You've been there 4 times, am I right?
Even more.
Wow.
Even more at this stage. I can't explain what it is that grabs me about Waterloo in particular. It's just, even though it was fought 200 years ago, it's one of the best kept battlefields in Europe. Go check it out. It's amazing. The farmhouses that they fought in and around are still there with musket ball holes in
still
the walls.
there.
And we're going to visit there.
La Haye-Saint and La Hougoumont.
We've got all these iconic places. But we thought, just to give an introduction to the whole Wellington and Napoleon and the epic Battle of Waterloo, we thought, where is the most obvious connection in Dublin to these epic events in France?
Yeah.
Right
Wellington
here.
Monument.
The Wellington Monument. Its construction was about 1817, so 2 years after the great encounter on the fields of Waterloo, built by subscriptions from grateful members, I suppose, of society to Wellington's great victory.
Okay.
So they started this in 1817.
Yeah.
But then they ran out of funds.
All right.
So it remained like this weird, eerie, empty shell until the 1860s. 1861 they only finished it off.
Okay.
They didn't have enough money to complete it. And it kind of left here as this kind of ruin that people would avoid for many years until they finally got it together to fix it. Now what we see is, it's called an obelisk. Which was very popular at the time. It's about 60 metres high, it's about 200 feet high.
Have a look at the engravings, will we?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's one of the tallest in Europe. And it's been here ever since. And it's a very popular spot for Dublin people to come out and visit.
But most of them, to be honest with you, probably wouldn't have a rashers with the, what the significance of it is.
It's known as the Wellington Monument, but I mean, if you ask people who Wellington was and what the significance of the monument is, I think I'd agree with you, they wouldn't necessarily know. I've brought people up here before and had to explain exactly what it is.
Okay.
Which is a bit a myth. Yeah, it's just the scale of it. You can check that out. Get some of those viewpoints in. I'll explain exactly a little bit about the plaques that we see here. Obviously this one is to Wellington. It's engraved Asian Europe saved by thee, proclaimed invincible in war thy deathless name. It's very grand title.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this was the plaque.
He was born here.
He was born in Merrion Square in Dublin.
Yeah.
But he wouldn't have considered himself
He's a
Irish.
Brit. He's a Brit.
He's a Brit.
Full on,
He comes from a landed Anglo-Irish family.
Yeah.
And he famously said, which I love, I think sums up his hard-nosed character, because he was called Nosy.
Right, yeah.
So literally his hard-nosed character was, he said famously one time, just because one is born in a stable does not make one a horse. So he's not very proud
of his heritage.
He once famously described his soldiers that served him at Waterloo, of which, another point to make, is about 40% of them were actually Irish.
Right.
Born in Ireland. This is often overlooked. The red coats that formed those lines.
Yeah.
And were murdered in their hundreds at that battle.
It was a brutal battle. Jesus,
brutal,
as far as combat goes, and you'd even look at the horrors of modern combat, I actually don't think the close quarters, hand-to-hand combat gets any worse than what was experienced in Waterloo. I think that is the epitome of barbarity on a battlefield.
Standing line in line, and it was not seemingly gentlemanly to flinch, even though they could see cannonballs, which would bounce on the ground in front of them and take off
the legs and
men's
stuff.
legs.
Wow.
4 rank and file would drop, and you had to stand there, particularly the guys, the colour sergeants with the colours, could not flinch. They just had to stand there.
And the point, what the J's are you walking around with a flag, It's
this is another great
symbolic.
point. People don't understand this because they think of modern warfare, and it's all hidden in camouflage. Whereas back then they stood in lines, and people don't understand why did they do that? Why did they do that? Because it was all about presence on the field and to intimidate the enemy. You couldn't be seen hiding or scurrying around. It was all about facing up to your enemy and just going at it.
Right. Okay.
Just who would be the last man standing? Like two boxers.
Yeah.
Heavyweight boxers just pummeling each other in the face repeatedly, and watching men drop and just holding your nerve.
But even with that in mind, I mean, timing was everything when it came to the movement of these large. I mean, what was it? I think there was something like 52,000 Prussian troops and 67,000 or 68,000 of Wellington's troops versus 110 or something, wasn't it? I think of Napoleon's army.
With both the Prussians and the British combined, almost equals the French army. So they fought in Waterloo, which is, get this, is like a 2 square miles battlefield.
Okay.
That may sound like a lot.
Yeah.
If you just scan around here, it's not much bigger.
Right.
Than this.
Okay.
Where we are now. Like roughly, I'm not going to point out the parameters, but you're talking about,
you can see it.
Over 100,000 men packed into
something
like this area.
Yeah.
Fighting it out for 10, 11 hours solid in one day.
Yeah.
And what I love about that battle in particular was that was the end.
Right.
Empire. It was settled in one day.
That is just astonishing, to think that is how these things worked. I mean, it was almost like a game of chess, it wasn't. This is the thing, the age of total war had not arrived. Mind you, though, they did pillage the locals. They got to feed their horses for fodder, and they had to feed themselves too, right?
They absolutely did. So, but Wellington, was a bit of a stern, came from that stern backdrop of the opposite. He in India, which is actually right there.
Oh yeah.
His battles in India.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other campaign. You could write books and books and books about it. But
against the Maratha uprising, I think it was.
That's very good. Yeah. And with French backing them up.
Yeah, assistance on. Yeah.
Oh, obviously he was working on behalf of the
British East India Company. I mean, a private, no different to Google. A private company taking over the world, which eventually got nationalised,
We spoke about this before. And so, basically, he was a servant of, a private enterprise, but under the guise of British imperialism and expansionism.
Nuts.
But just getting back to the original point there about him being stern, from that, he had men flogged in India. He had men hung for looting.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
So the British Army were known for the tough disciplinarian kind of outlook. It didn't stop them.
Yeah.
But going to get some fodder for your horses is quite okay. But breaking into people's houses or
stealing their bread,
the locals is a no-go. Very strict policy about that.
And something I've heard, and again, this is fairly gruesome too. I mean, of the time, right? How they dealt with the dead. Obviously, there was a lot. There had to be. This is the gruesome bit. As far as I understand, it was both locals plus your own army who would have stripped the clothes from your back and left you dying naked on the field. And some people took all their worldly possessions, and there were people who were trading in teeth. Isn't it?
This is absolutely. They were actually called Waterloo teeth. They were very popular in society in London. You could buy, wooden dentures with soldiers' teeth. And why were they popular? Because soldiers were young men who died, so their teeth would have been relatively, considering the diet at the time, wouldn't have been great, but they would have been in relatively good condition. So they became known as Waterloo teeth. That's actually a fact. So they would have gone around to dead bodies.
Imagine, but there was people probably not even dead.
There's many instances in the aftermath of Waterloo of the locals going down and looting the bodies and stabbing, killing wounded soldiers, because they didn't have great medical kind of support systems. So a lot of the soldiers would have been left, and obviously the French army withdrew. It was a rout, but they were chased back into France. So the British armies, the Allied armies, the Prussians didn't have time to go back and look after their own. Hundreds, tens of thousands of wounded men would have been left on the field. And what's actually really interesting, just this year, they found the only second intact skeleton on the field of Waterloo. Considering tens of thousands died there and were pushed into mass graves, they were saying, where are all the bodies? Despite numerous attempts to try and find these mass graves, they never did. And only this year, an operation called Waterloo Uncovered, it's like a charity for soldiers who would have, fought in Afghanistan and that. They can go and they do these digs in Waterloo. Only this summer they found the only second intact remains of a soldier. And what they found out is, one of the theories, which actually stands up, is that the bones were removed from these mass pits in the years after the battle, ground down into fertilizer and sold to farmers.
And then fed back into the food chain to those humans.
And
CJD, huh?
That's it. And now what they've realised, this is even more astonishing, it's a bit complicated, but these beet farms, for processing sugar, they use the bones crushed up as a kind of filter device. So the bones would have, like, you know, there's a quote from one of the historians, like some papers they found in the newspapers afterwards, is that your grandfather could end up in your sweetened tea. Because back then they didn't have the same sensibilities with death.
And cannibalism, perhaps.
Might be stretching it a bit there, but sure, why not?
Jeez. No, so tell us, right? So like Waterloo is the big event, right? But there's two significant other battles at Ligny and Quatre Bras that have a big significance. But after those two battles, am I right in thinking that really it was Napoleon who had the upper hand? It was his battle to lose.
100% correct. The Allies were on the back feet. He'd sent at Ligny, as you said, gave the Prussians what was called at the time a bloody nose. It sounds a bit more bloody than that. It was a horrific battle. These battles are sometimes overlooked because Waterloo, like you described it, was the main event, and because of the British, it was the British battle effectively until the Prussians came, arguably controversially, to their aid. Depends, you might pee off some people by saying that. But yeah, Ligny was 2 days before, and they were brutal battles. He pushed the Prussians. His idea was, when the Allies were approaching him in Paris, where he'd come back after exile, the Allies were saying, we're not going through this again. So they started to form. The British were already in Europe. The Prussians were there. The Austrian-Hungarians were mobilising, and the Russians were on their way.
And it was official, like this was an actual alliance now, wasn't it? Like rock solid.
This was absolutely. They would have had whatever differences they had amongst themselves, they put it all away, because this was the dictator, the mad demon back, risen to power again. So he had to be stopped. So the best form of defence, attack. So what Napoleon did is he mobilised his army up the north, and he struck north up through Charleroi in Belgium and heading towards Brussels. And the point was, he needed to get in between the British on the left-hand side and the Prussians on the right-hand side.
Divide and conquer.
Defeat one, then defeat the other. And then he would start negotiating with the other powers on their way. And he almost bloody well did it. He knocked the Prussians reeling back. He thought they were gone, off the game board, off the chessboard.
Including Blucher.
And Blucher famously was injured. He fell under his horse. He's just explained, Blucher was like, 72-year-old Grand Marshal of the Prussian army. He was like called General Four Vorts.
And who had retired, right? He was brought out of retirement for
I
this,
think
I think
so. Like, he was like, he was not mellowed, but he was starting to put him out into pasture when he took over the Prussian cause again. He had great officers under Scharnhorst, all these names that come up again in Hitler's time, because he would have named battleships, Gneisnu, all these guys, Muffling, all these guys, and he would have named battleships after him. Such famous characters. But Blucher led the charge at Ligny. He was trapped on his horse for hours. They thought he was gone. His subordinates took the decision to withdraw, but they didn't go back to Prussia. They just went north to a place called Wavre, which is still on the chessboard, but the French thought they were gone. Next he turns his attention at Quatre Bras, under Marshal Ney, the crazy red-haired Marshal Ney. He's such a wild character. At the Battle of Waterloo itself, the next day, he had like 7 horses shot out from underneath him. He was famously seen pacing the battlefield with his broken sword, hitting it on the cannon mouth. He was probably suffering from what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. This guy was just out of control. So, he would have led the famous cavalry charges at Waterloo the next day without Napoleon's permission. It's a bit controversial that Napoleon would have said that Marshal Ney lost him.
Oh, really?
Waterloo. But where Wellington comes back in is Wellington holds Quatre Bras with the Scottish Grenadiers, and they lose heavily. It's not a great defensive position, but he's smart. He reconnoitred the land years before. He was always checking out the land, and he had spotted this ridge at Mont Saint-Jean,
Okay.
just outside of Waterloo,
Okay.
as a good defensive position. What he did at the time, we were talking earlier about lines of soldiers firing into each other. Wellington kind of was a bit smarter at that age. He made his men lie down behind this ridge.
Okay.
So when the French came up the next morning on the 18th of June,
Yeah.
and start pounding the British lines with Napoleon's beautiful daughters, these 24-pound cannons, 160 of them, I think, pounding the British lines. Cannonballs would come, they would stick in the mud because it was raining heavily the night before, or they would just bounce over this ridge. So the British lines are relatively intact for most of the day.
Okay, so
That's where Wellington held
natural
this
fortress,
It was a natural ridge line that the soldiers could, it didn't protect them all, obviously.
But and the thing is, they couldn't see them. The French couldn't see them.
The
Right?
French could make out their encampments. They could see the fires from the night before. They were within shouting distance of each other.
Right.
The next morning, Napoleon famously delayed the battle because it had rained the night before, and he needed the ground to dry out so he could send his cavalry into the British lines.
Yeah.
Also for his artillery to do their work.
Okay.
But he left it just a little bit too long, because then the Prussians, reeling after their defeat at Ligny, had reformed and had come dramatically to Wellington's aid only about 7 o'clock in the evening. And this battle has been going on since 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning, which is quite a late start for a battle. So they did come to their aid just as the British lines were just starting to crack. See, as you said earlier, it was Napoleon's to lose. He almost
had it.
It almost worked.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
his crazy plan to knock out one, knock out the other, probably he was within an hour or two of achieving that. And he would have been in Brussels. The British would have fled back towards the coast where their supply lines were. The Prussians would have been out of the picture, and we'd all be speaking French.
See, the thing about that, just on Napoleon, again, this is kind of not really about Waterloo as such, but like he had such a meteoric rise to power, 4-year period, then went on this mad dash spree to kill everyone. Now, like that was obviously Nazi Germany, but like people still look at Napoleon as maybe being a hero or some kind of amazing general. He's not looked at in a very bad light. He was a mass murderer, simple,
Yeah, he was a man of his time, I suppose.
Okay.
When, like the Europe would have been a very fractured place, as arguably it still is to this day. But even back then, there was a lot of insecurity, a lot of changing borders, a lot of people who spoke one language yet lived in a different province.
Okay.
All this sort of Germany didn't really exist as a country. Italy didn't exist as a country as we know them now until way, way later. So you had all these different city-states and different factions and different people's backgrounds are all completely different. So it was all starting to form. But Napoleon, arguably he started off as, a very talented artillery commander and rose up through the ranks. He was like a child of the French Revolution, which in some circles was considered a good thing, to get rid of the monarchies that dominated Europe for so many years and kept the poor oppressed. So he could be seen in some lights as a bit of a hero. And then, of course, like most dictators, he just lost the run of himself.
Yeah, completely.
Power goes to the head, power corrupts, and he embarked on this. I suppose what most dictators, somewhere in their deepest, darkest minds, they want to make the world after them. It's some sort of massive, I wouldn't even say an ego trip, what would you say? Like they want to become kings of the world, gods.
Well, I suppose it comes down to, what people say about CEOs and business and stuff. They're all sociopaths.
Yeah.
That's it.
Does that make you one then?
No, definitely not. Small scale, but the people, where it is when you become that driven and you don't care who you stand over or what you do to get what you're after.
Ruthless.
Yeah, that's
no
the
empathy.
none.
They don't think or feel like normal human beings, But look, it makes for grand history.
Yeah,
it
true.
makes for great stories, and obviously a lot of suffering and pain and death along the way, but it is our history, and this is what makes it interesting. So,
and famously, when we're back onto the battlefield, there's some huge. I think there's 3 pivotal battles, am I right? Where that decide the outcome, and they're very. Le Hougoumont was the crack British soldiers, am I right? They were
Coldstream
holed
guards.
up there, yeah, okay.
Mhm.
And like they resisted despite fire, were they set on fire?
The Hougoumont was like a fortified. They made it. It was
Farmhouse, right?
It was a farmhouse, effectively, not what we'd imagine a farmhouse. It wasn't just one structure. There would have been a sequence of walls
And courtyard and
courtyards.
stuff like that.
Because back then, like, you know, rural Europe would have been, you know, there would have been brigands out there. There would have been bandits.
Yeah.
So like farmers would have been
And
effectively
big wooden gates, is that right?
big wooden
Yeah.
gates. There's iconic gates there that we must visit when we get an opportunity. Famously defended when the French broke in and that were protected by the Coldstream Guards. And managed the closing of the gates was the moment Wellington said saved the Battle of Waterloo for
Okay,
him. It's this
okay.
iconic. We'll go into that more in detail when we actually hopefully get to
Yeah.
visit.
But the French did get in though, right?
They did get in,
Yeah.
and famously they were led by Le Enforceur. He was like this sapper with his huge mallet. There's pictures, there's paintings of him smashing in through the gates. He gets in, 12 guys pile in after him, and a drummer boy. And within minutes, the only person left standing was the drummer boy.
The French
They
drummer
closed
boy.
the gates
Okay.
behind them
Wow.
and slaughtered them. But
Okay.
they left the drummer boy alive.
Oh,
He was
right.
just a drummer
Wow.
boy.
Okay.
Leave
Okay.
him alone.
Jesus, look at this now. Actually, here's a piece of other history I think behind
Yeah.
us, which is the magazine fort
magazine
in
fort.
Phoenix Park. But anyway, let's continue on our wander.
So this is obviously Waterloo that we will go back to.
Yeah, we're going to have to do a
we'll
detail one. I'd love you to take me through all the little elements of the.
100%.
I've read a couple of very good books on it. You've read more, but it's like as far as excitement and thrill of
the
a battle
colour.
and the colour, yeah,
Like
and the
it-
description of it. There's so many accounts of it that you're able to get a very, very detailed, vivid
It's amazing
understanding
for
of it.
200 years ago how many written accounts there were, usually by officers.
Yeah.
Men wouldn't have necessarily been that educated, but there are many accounts and written in great detail, and by Irishmen as well who would have served there. So a great battlefield to visit. But in the meantime, just getting back to the Wellington Monument, yeah, it still stands a great popular spot. There's a couple of great stories about it, though. I want to tell you.
Yeah, cool.
One of them, we saw the plaques earlier on.
Yeah.
I think it was mentioned that they are cast from cannon, French cannon captured.
Those
on the
rectangular
battlefield.
plaques. Yeah.
Those rectangular plaques that we
Wow.
saw, the bronze ones there earlier. If you look back in the video, you'll see them. They were actually cannon taken from the French,
Right.
Napoleon's beautiful daughters, melted down and cast as little plaques. So
As,
it's
as,
like
as,
a
a,
real,
as two fingers.
it's a real two fingers.
Yeah.
It really is. It's like the Lion Monument on the battlefield of Waterloo, which is a lion perched on this huge pyramid that they built
Right.
where the Crown Prince was wounded. And there's a lion on the top of it, and the lion with his paws up like this, and he's facing towards France.
Okay.
So like a message, isn't it?
It is, yeah, for
victors.
sure.
The victors leaving their message. Another story about the Wellington Monument. This is a little bit out there, but I'll go with it anyway because it's kind of urban myth. During the time when they were trying to raise subscriptions to pay for the monument, the aristocracy of Dublin held a dinner
Right.
within the confines of Wellington Monument. Get this.
Right,
So they had
okay.
a dinner party in there. You can imagine them all.
Yeah,
Their ties and their nice shoes, and they had a table set up there
right.
with these butlers that would have been serving them wine and various courses of the meal. And then afterwards, as a kind of a weird idea of the time, they sealed up the Wellington Monument, but they left their tables and they left their dining room
No
there.
way.
And according to myth, according to the ghost tour of Dublin, one solitary drunk butler who they only realised after they sealed him.
Oh no.
They'd forgotten him because he liked to have a tipple of the expensive wines that he
Yeah.
wouldn't be allowed to, and
Oh,
hid away.
God.
And he was never discovered. So to this day,
Oh dear.
there is
Dear,
the body.
dear. The body.
If you want to believe that. I think
Yeah,
it's true.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Tess, we'll probably have a wander in the magazine for it, but now, so La Hissente is another farmhouse structure again.
This is back in Waterloo. You have the Hougoumont, La Hissente, which is. I think it's. I'll come back to you on that one.
Okay, yeah.
Momentarily forgotten what that means. Another fortified farmhouse that withstood the French. Now, in that case, the French did get in at about 6 p.m.
Okay.
They ran out of ammunition effectively.
Right.
When you go there, the British lines are 200 yards away. Why they couldn't get the ammunition down is a controversy to this day.
Okay.
And it was
Okay.
a brutal battle. It was the King's German Legion that held La Hissente. Germans were part of the British Army as much as the Irish were, but they had their own regiments. Again,
Right.
elite sharpshooters, held out to the very last minute, had no ammunition and ran.
Right.
A few survivors, only 40 or 50 or 60 of them out of the original complement of about 480 men that day.
Okay.
They held out down. Now the French had a position right up against Wellington's lines, brought up artillery to start ploughing the red squares, the squares of the red-coated soldiers, including the Enniskillen Brigade, who literally died in square. We were saying earlier that they didn't duck, they didn't flinch.
Yeah.
These would have been, I think there's a plaque to them on the battlefield now of 780 men that took the field that day.
Okay.
There was only a few dozen left.
Oh, wow.
And they literally died in square.
So the square, it was the defensive formation to defend against cavalry.
Correct.
And the line was infantry.
There was effectively several different formations that infantry at the time would have taken square, as you said, when they were confronted by cavalry, because no horse is going to go on to. So the soldiers in the front rank would kneel,
Yeah.
second rank like this,
Okay.
and third rank behind, and
Okay.
the officers and the colours
In the middle.
of the square.
Yeah.
You could have 30 or 40 men on each side.
Okay.
So you can imagine how bristling with bayonets, and they'd put their bayonets on top of these Baker rifles right at the very front. No horse is going to jump into that. And repeatedly that day, the French tried to break in, never broke one square.
Okay. Okay. Wow.
Now, they were then, it was like rock, scissors, and paper.
Yeah.
Because the square is then vulnerable to artillery, because of a dense group
Oh,
of men.
yeah, packed together.
You bring up one of those Napoleon's beautiful daughters, 24-pound cannon,
Yeah.
it will plough solid metal shot right through those ranks.
It's horrible when you can think of those cannonballs. It's hard to imagine because we've got exploding shells today.
Yes,
but these were
exactly.
just balls that literally just would snap people's legs and stuff off.
They
and
would
that
keep
just
going.
Keep going,
there's
yeah.
accounts
Unstoppable.
of 20 men in one file, all taken out.
Right.
Not necessarily all killed, but immobilised.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
legs,
And with
arms,
severe injury,
severe
yeah.
injury.
Yeah.
They're out of the game. Like,
Yeah,
you know.
and you'd be better off actually being killed in an
There
with
was
explosive
many
shells.
accounts of survivors on the battlefield. The next day just could put me out of my misery. You know,
Yeah,
'cause they wouldn't-
yeah.
No hospital treatment, no medical treatment drugs. Another infantry formation, of course, obviously was the line.
Okay.
Now, the line was good for taking on other enemy lines. It was, less of a target for artillery, but it was really vulnerable to a cavalry attack.
Yeah.
So cavalry could get right in through a line, cut them up into pieces.
And once
That's
they're
what happened.
behind, right,
Once
that's-
they're
yeah.
This is exactly what happened at Quatre Bras.
Okay.
The Scottish primarily were in lines. They didn't see the French cavalry coming through the very high crops.
Yeah.
And they were famously cut to pieces. They suffered heavily. Because it's a matter of like moving these different formations, like on a chessboard,
Yeah.
and getting it right at the right time. Get the wrong time, and there's cavalry there or artillery there, and you're going to pay for, or rather the soldiers are going to pay for.
Yeah, Jesus, brutal stuff. And what then decides? So this goes on late into the evening.
late into the
Napoleon
evening.
through all of this. Where is he?
Yeah, now he's out of the count. He's
Right.
suffering from, take your pick, piles, apathy. Was he depressed?
Okay.
He left effectively everything up to his generals, including the aforementioned Marshal Ney. He came up to his own little farmhouse, which he could see the British lines from, and famously set up a table and kind of sat there drinking wine
Right.
in the course of the day. Sort of like taking a back step. He wasn't himself.
Okay.
As generals said he was. That morning, he was full of enthusiasm. He asked his generals their opinions of the British, because he hadn't faced Wellington before,
Yeah.
and they were saying we have to be careful, they're very good in defensive nature, and he almost snapped at them. He said, you overrate the British. He
Wow.
said, this business will be over by lunchtime. And he
Right.
actually has his resplendent uniforms prepared to have dinner that night in Brussels.
Okay.
That's how super confident he was in the morning. And yet for the rest of the afternoon, he's lying around, apathetic, blaming people for mistakes when he's not even there.
Wow.
What happened? What's going on? There's all sorts of theories that how he was affected mentally, like on the day of what should have been one of his biggest victories.
Well, I suppose this was going to seal his fate, whatever happened. And, again, it's even with the successes of the days before, it was still, reasonably 50-50. Say hello to some sea deer.
There we go.
We got them.
Native to the park, don't feed.
Yeah, do not feed, that's for sure.
Very cute.
Yeah, I think they're, will they stay? They might. Anyway, okay, they're off. Back to the battle.
Yeah. There they go. They would have gone down well with the troops if they
Yeah, yeah.
sort of eating horse and whatever.
Anything to get their hands on, yeah.
Herring they could get their hands on. So yeah, Napoleon, he took his hands off the steering wheel. He fully confident that morning. It's hard to, there's no one set explanation as to what was going wrong with him that day.
Okay.
But certainly like the great cavalry charge, the last like great efforts of the French to break through the British lines, they send these massive cavalry charges. You imagine, you watch the Grand National today, it's 40 odd horses.
Yeah.
And even just watching it on TV, you can hear the pounding of it. Can you imagine 9,000 horsemen at one stage, charging towards you?
Yeah.
And what it must have felt like to be a British redcoat, 19, 20 years of age, probably your first time in battle, seeing this coming at you. It required some nerve, and they held their nerve. But Napoleon reappears on the battlefield. He sees the cavalry completely, not destroyed, but they haven't broken through the squares.
Right.
They're all over the place, and he blames Ney.
Okay.
Ney had took it upon himself to charge. He thought he saw the British retreating. They weren't. There was just wounded streaming back to Brussels. Various camp followers all streaming back when they thought the battle was lost. So he sends in these great cavalry charges, and he was mistaken. He gets over this ridge and he's confronted with a chessboard of British squares.
Oh no, okay.
And that's it. They just rifle fire barrels straight into the flanks of the French cavalry. That was one of the last great charges of the day, probably about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. But then famously, the end of the battle is the old guard, Napoleon's best soldiers, the ones that have been with him from the very start. Huge men.
Okay.
They would have had to serve 20 years, 30 years. They're all full of tattoos.
Right.
They've got big bearskin hats this size, so they look huge.
Yeah, big Busby type thing.
Big Busby type thing. And they march into battle. And the British held their line, and it was guardsmen against guardsmen, the elite versus the elite. They stood up at a command under Captain Maitland, where Wellington said, "Now Maitland, now's your time." And the whole British front rank, thousands of redcoats, stood up and in one volley dropped the guard.
No way.
They lost hundreds, and they wavered. The guard wavers. They had a saying, the guard never retreats.
Yeah, right.
Can you imagine the crash of that volley?
Yeah.
Thousands of muskets going off at the same time. Next rank stands up.
Right.
Another volley. At this stage, there's then French dropping in droves.
And that's it. You can't replace these guys. They're too
They're
experienced.
too experienced. There's only 4,000 or 5,000 of them.
Okay.
But then around to their flank from Hougoumont, this captain, his name escapes at the moment, but he's revered, takes it upon himself to move his regiment round to their flank, which the French don't even see. And then from their right-hand side, another massive volley. It sounds like it would sound like a cannon shot, because it would all be fired at the same time. And now the guard are looking like this, because they're being fired on from all angles, from all sides. The British notice first just a waver, and then a sort of a stop, and then a sort of backing like this, a few steps, and suddenly they turn and run. And that's it.
Game over.
Game over. It changed on the
it changed history. And as a result of this, I think it was after that England ended up guaranteeing the neutrality of Belgium,
right,
which essentially drew the English into the First World War.
Into the First World War. And then
100 years later, the resonance.
100 years later, 1915, you had British soldiers passing through Waterloo up to Hougoumont and paying their respects to the plaque, the Coldstream Guards. And history repeats itself.
Always.
Right.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Neil. That's
You're
great.
more than welcome, Derek. Hope you enjoyed that, viewers.
yeah.
Obviously, we will have to bring you to the battlefield itself so that we can show you all these places.
We will do that. Lots of interesting things and different takes on history. But for now, please like and subscribe.
Very important.
All this helps in keeping this going. We'd love to make this a full-time gig and bring history to the masses every week.
Yeah, and any suggestions you have as well in the comment section you might want us to cover.
Yeah,
put them in there. Any sort of feedback if we've made mistakes, point them out. Like I said, we are hipstorians. We're not hipsters. We're too old. We're not historians either. But we just love history and love bringing it to you.
Lovely. Thank you. Good night.